Chapter 13. Jake had never waited so long or worked so hard to seduce a female. But to be fair, he'd spent 3 years focused on not seducing her. To realize she was here and willing to understand that he only had to grasp her hand and lead her into his bedroom in order to have all that he'd ever wanted from her was surreal. Because he didn't expect to have another night like this, he decided he'd be wise to weave in all the fantasies that had swirled through his fevered brain. For 3 years. That meant beginning differently from the way he'd approached her in the kitchen. Then he'd been so overwhelmed by the prospect of having her, so intoxicated by the scent and feel of her, that he'd rushed it. "I have a favor to ask." His voice, rasping in the stillness of the bedroom, revealed his burning lust, and just how tightly it was leashed. Squeezing her hand, he let go and stepped back. "What?" Her reply was breathy with anticipation. "When I was in your bedroom after being wounded, I crawled under your bed. And I wondered why. The razor. I couldn't let you shave me. I had a forest run with other werewolves scheduled in San Francisco, and I didn't want to explain to them why I was shaved." Laughter danced in her eyes. "Oh. But when I was under the bed, I couldn't watch you undress. Is that the request? To watch me take my clothes off?" He nodded. Such a simple thing. Backing away a little more, she nudged off her shoes. "Not to me. I've imagined you here stripping down because you can hardly wait to show me what I so desperately want to see. But I'm just an ordinary shoe. You're a goddess. Your skin is like satin. I know that now because I've touched you, but somehow I've always known." She'd taken hold of her t-shirt hem, but she paused. "I need to do this." "Right." Releasing her hold on the shirt, she reached behind her back and slid both hands under the shirt to unhook her bra. Once it was free, she whipped off both her bra and the shirt in one dramatic motion. He caught his breath. In the kitchen, he'd been too intent on caressing her to really look. Now he did. She was lush, ripe, tantalizing almost beyond his ability to control himself. Saliva pooled in his mouth as he imagined swirling his tongue over each of her raspberry-tipped breasts. He would take his time, cup them in his palms, and savor the pebbled texture while she moaned with pleasure. She couldn't know that her massage intensified the sweet aroma of her skin, a powerful trigger for a creature with a heightened sense of smell. Her preference for almond lotion and soap had always drawn him, but now he breathed in her essence, that pheromone-laden scent that was unique to her and the most compelling aphrodisiac he'd encountered in any female ever. Her eyes lit with mischief. "Am I creating the fantasy you had in mind, Jake?" Coherent speech had deserted him. He hadn't counted on her vivid imagination, but he should have after admiring her carving wizardry all these years. She might not have his physical stamina, but she was miles ahead of him in the fantasy department. "I'm glad I'm pleasing you." Slowly moving her hands down her torso, she reached for the fastening on her jeans. She held his gaze as she undid the metal button and inched the zipper down. He expected her to wiggle out of the jeans once they were loose enough to slide over her hips, and then she would be his, every sweet-smelling inch of her. His nostrils flared. But instead she slipped one hand under the elastic of her panties and eased it down until, dear God, she was pleasuring herself. Earthy and primitive, the scent of her arousal was more than he could take. He held his breath to block it, but he had to breathe, and when he did, his heart kicked into overdrive and the crotch of his jeans felt like a vice squeezing his privates. She moved her hand faster and with obvious intent as her lips parted and her breathing quickened. Her nipples puckered in response to her impending climax. "Don't come." He gulped for air and fought the animal instincts that urged him to take her now. Her question came out as a short gasp. "Why not?" "Because," wrenching his zipper down, he closed the gap between them and pulled her hand from her panties, "because I'll pass out or go insane if I have to wait another second." Pushing her jeans to the floor, he lifted one of her legs from the confining denim. That was all he needed, one leg free. He backed her against the nearest wall, not even caring which one, knowing only that he needed a surface that wouldn't give way as he drove into her. At last he could breathe, because at last he could satisfy the pounding need she'd unwittingly escalated beyond all endurance. She might not be athletic, but she obviously understood the basics of this position. She wrapped her legs around his waist and clutched his shoulders as he began to move. He could have supported her without that extra help, but he was willing to accept it because it allowed him to relax and enjoy the ride. And that meant relishing her response when she came, and if he was very lucky, when she came a second time. Once they were both steady, he looked into her eyes. How's that? Her low chuckle was the sexiest laugh he'd ever heard. What about your famous stamina, big boy? When he opened his eyes, she was smiling at him. You sabotaged it, you sexy woman. I wanted to fulfill your fantasy. You did. And then some. Later he might tell her how far she'd pushed him, without even knowing it. He eased back and slid home again. What about your fantasy? This, she gasped as he pulled away and pushed in tight. This handles it. Too bad. He began to pump faster. I was hoping you'd want another round. I might. I just might. You're very convincing, Jake. Rachel. 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 As long as he lived, he would remember this moment. And this woman. This very human and very fragrant woman. Rachel discovered she liked being with a physically fit male creature who could carry her around. After experiencing the most shattering climax of her life, she didn't have the strength to stand, let alone walk over to the bed. Jake carried her there. Problem solved. He even managed to slide the covers out from under her limp body so that she was lying on the soft bottom sheet. Jake obviously favored a high thread count. She did too, but his concept of luxury bedding was even more evolved than hers. She liked that in a man-werewolf. In her post-orgasmic haze, she wasn't particularly concerned about Jake's alternate persona. He was behaving like a particularly strong and very solicitous lover, which certainly worked no matter what he became in his spare time. He finished undressing her so that every inch of her could appreciate the softness of his sheets, which were pale green and had a masculine scent that reminded her of sage. The room dimmed as he closed curtains or blinds or both. She didn't look to find out. She was still riding the smooth wave of the climax he'd given her, and wasn't interested in the details of anything other than this huge, incredible bed. And huge, incredible Jake. When he climbed in beside her, the mattress didn't shift much at all. Firm, strong bed with luscious sheets turned out to be a seductive combination. Slowly Jake began stroking her with his big hands. Her eyes still closed, she stretched like a cat under his lazy caress. It's late, he murmured. I should probably let you sleep. But as he outlined each curve with the tips of his fingers, he didn't seem inclined to do that. Opening her eyes, she discovered that he was following the tracing motion of his hands with his gaze, almost as if he were finger-painting a pattern on her skin and wanted to get it right. She'd never had anyone focus so intently on her body. She wondered why she wasn't self-conscious under his close scrutiny and decided his attitude had everything to do with it. She was willing to lie there and let him explore because his appreciation made her feel beautiful, cherished and sensual. A girl could get used to that. She wouldn't let herself, though. He'd suspended his moral code on an extremely temporary basis. This blindingly erotic encounter would be brief and all the sweeter for that, probably. As he continued mapping her body, he trailed his fingers down her thigh to her calf, which was as far as he could reach without changing position. Pausing, he lifted his head to look into her eyes. Do you want to sleep? No. Reaching for him, she cupped his cheek and felt the slight bristle of his beard. I can always sleep, but I won't always have a chance to lie in this bed with you. Regret flashed in his eyes. No, you won't. That's why I'm memorizing you. She brushed her thumb over his jaw. Am I different from your lovers? She understood that her novelty might be part of his fascination, but that was okay. If he only allowed himself to have one human sexual partner, she was happy to be his choice. I mean, of course I'm different. I can't become a wolf. But if you compare me with a female werewolf in human form, am I any different? Yes, he said without hesitation. That surprised her. How? The biggest difference is your scent. Capturing her hand, he turned his head so he could kiss her palm. Werewolves don't like almond? He tickled her palm with his tongue. This werewolf loves it. The smell of almonds will always remind me of you. Gets me hot. But that's not what I meant. Then do explain, Professor Wolf. Okay. Releasing her hand, he swung one leg over her hips and was soon braced above her on his forearms and knees. But I can talk and kiss you at the same time. Really? Now you're a ventriloquist too. I meant I'd be butterfly kissing your body, not French kissing your mouth. Leaning forward, he started with her forehead. Like this. His lips brushed lightly over her brow. Nice. And this. He touched his lips to the end of her nose. But I'm skipping that. Sexy mouth. You kiss like a porn star. She wasn't sure whether to be insulted or not. How do you know? Have you kissed one? He laughed. No. Just watch the video. He nuzzled her throat. They give it. They're all, and so do you. If I let myself get involved with your mouth, I'll never finish paying attention to the rest of you. I'll take that as a compliment then. I meant it to be. He moved slowly across her shoulder and down her left arm, dropping kisses along the way. It seemed innocent at first, but as her skin began to tingle, she realized how potent this seemingly low-impact caress could be. He was seducing her a millimeter at a time. The thing about werewolves, he said as he moved to her other shoulder to give it the same treatment, is that of the five senses, smell is our most acute. If a were in human form walked into a room, you would never know. But I would by the scent. His warm breath touched the places he'd moistened with his lips. Oh, now she was tingling and deliciously shivery too. Do males and females smell different? Yes, but not a lot different. He kissed the tips of her fingers and paused. Plus each individual varies in scent. Humans, on the other hand, smell altogether different from worse, and they have as many individual variations as werewolves do. When he paused, she expected him to move back up her body to her collarbone and work down from there. But instead he slipped to the end of the bed and began kissing her toes. That tickles. Then I'd better hold you still so you don't kick me in the face. He grasped both ankles as he took his time, placing his mouth on her toes, her heels, and the arch of each foot. She'd never realized the arch of her foot was an erogenous zone. Judging from the zing of sensation between her thighs, the arch of her foot was prime sensual real estate. In other words, he continued, I have a very sensitive nose and I know what I like. The almond scent is a nice touch, but your own special aroma, the one you don't even realize you have, drives me crazy. He began his journey from her ankles up her calf toward her knee. Her breathing grew shallow. Speaking of driving someone crazy, you're having quite an effect with those little kisses, Jake. I can tell. He kissed the back of her knee and took a deep breath. You smell more delicious by the second. Are you going to eat me up? He laughed. How did you guess? She knew what he meant and wasn't frightened in the least. As he kissed his way along her inner thigh, his destination obvious, she trembled with anticipation. Chances were he'd be very good at what he was about to do. She was in for a treat. Apparently so was he. Until now she'd been kidding herself that he was no different from any guy she'd had sex with. Sure, he had a few more muscles and could carry her to bed without breaking a sweat, but that only meant he was in great shape, not that he was different. But he was different. His senses were sharper than any human's. Every physical experience he had would be enhanced as a result. Stood to reason that his sensual appetites would be highly developed to match his greater capacity for enjoyment. Now she recognized him for what he was, a creature not of her kind. She felt it in the grip of his strong hands as he steadied her for his purposeful assault. She heard it in the rasp of his breathing, saw it in the fierce joy lighting his eyes before he dipped his head to take what he wanted. She surrendered to pleasure that whispered of primitive cravings and untamed desire. At last she understood that with every moment in his embrace she'd slip further from the civilized world and deeper into the wild place that Jake called home. Although he appeared to be a man, beneath his muscled chest beat the heart of a Chapter 14. Jake knew the exact moment when Rachel fully realized who and what he was. He saw it in her silver eyes right before he captured her in that most intimate of kisses. If he'd seen fear in her gaze, he would have released her. But instead of fear, he saw excitement. She knew him as a werewolf and she wanted him anyway. No, that was wrong. She didn't want him in spite of his shape-shifting nature, but because of it. His wildness spoke to something wild in her and welcomed it in him. Her complete acceptance was more than he'd ever hoped for, and it meant he could give her so much more. He could call to that primitive part of her that longed to loosen the polite bonds of society. He could teach her to grasp the Power of raw hunger instead. And he could start now. Gone were the butterfly kisses. He thrust deep with his tongue, invading her most private spaces without giving her time to think, or even to breathe. He applied relentless suction and she came in a heartbeat, arching off the bed and pressing herself against his mouth. Her panting cries filled the room. He went deeper, pushed her harder, and she writhed on the bed in ecstasy. When she came again, she swore so colorfully he laughed. The vibration of his laughter sent her spinning out of control again as she moaned and thrashed in his grip. He loved turning her inside out. He bore down again as she gasped and begged for one more climax, the kind that would leave her half-crazed with the majesty and wonder of it, the kind that stripped her down to the basics of what it meant to be a sexual animal. Her skin was slippery with sweat and her breathing was no longer ladylike and prim. She dragged in air through her mouth and uttered cries that had no resemblance to speech, but they spoke to him. Joy exploded within him at her willingness to shoot past the barriers and follow him to this place of uninhibited ecstasy, with a sound wrenched from the depths of her being, a sound more growl than groan. She surged over the precipice in one final glorious orgasm. Slowly he lowered her hips to the bed, but he stayed with her, savoring her juices, calming her with slow swipes of his tongue. She quivered as the aftershocks rippled through her body, and then she lay still. The room was quiet again except for the gentle sound of their breathing. Jake matched the rhythm of his breath to hers and relished the sound of that. His cock, thick and hot, reminded him that she'd had multiple orgasms but he had not. He would wait. When he took her again, he wanted her eagerness. Even Rachel, as sensual as she had proven to be, wouldn't be eager for him now. He smiled as he replayed her unbridled response to his lovemaking. Because they had no future, he shouldn't want to be the best lover she'd ever had. Unfortunately, he did want that. But it was wrong to hope she'd compare him to every mere human she had sex with and find them lacking. He didn't really wish her a life of sexual disappointment, did he? Well, no, not exactly. But he wouldn't mind if her future partners fell a little bit short. He fought his instinctive urge to slide up her sweat-soaked body and stake his claim. But he had no claim. Not now and not ever. That depressing thought made his breathing fall out of sync with hers. He listened for her rhythm so he could match it again and realize she'd fallen asleep, pillowing his head against her thigh. He breathed in her glorious fragrance, closed his eyes, and allowed his mind to relax into a dream. In that dream, he and Rachel were the only beings on the planet. With nothing standing in their way, they were free to stay together for as long as they liked. The thought of that fantasy, impossible though it was, soothed him. He slept. No telling how long he stayed asleep. He came instantly awake when she turned on her side and drew her thighs together, nearly smothering him. It would have been a decent way to go, but he wasn't ready to check out of this life. Not tonight. As he worked his way free of his satin prison, she moaned in her sleep but didn't wake up. He pushed himself to a sitting position and gazed at her. She lay stretched out on her right side, her head supported on her outflung arm. Her left arm rested against her side, with her elbow bent and her fingers curled lightly over her breast. The erotic pose aroused him with a jolt that made him suck in a breath. Whether his sharp gasp woke her, or a sixth sense told her she was being, and buried her face against the sheet. Rachel. Reaching out, he stroked her back. You okay? Her voice was muffled by the sheet. I'm feeling shy. I need a minute. Ah. He smiled and smoothed his hand over the curve of her sleek backside. Jake, I have never ever behaved like that with anyone. I don't know what came over me. Don't you? She might be hiding, but she'd given him a great view of her tempting ass. His instincts teased him with an image of Rachel on her hands and knees, and his groin tightened painfully. But he would never risk taking her from behind. It was the mating stance, and although mating required strong intention on both sides, he didn't trust himself or her for that matter. They might begin with no such intention, but once they were locked together, intentions could change. Maybe I do know. Sorry. He slipped his hand between her thighs. Can't quite hear you. She lifted her head a fraction. I said that maybe I do know what happened to me. And it's happening again. Moving sensuously and deliberately, she pushed her hips up and back to give him better access. I've become shameless, Jake. Good. His heart pounded with excitement as he moved his fingers in an easy rhythm. Shame shouldn't exist between us. I want you again. Her hips rose higher. Even after all those climaxes, I want more. Glad to hear it. Then take me, Jake. I will. He slipped his fingers free. Roll over and let me. No, her voice grew husky as she moved her hips in silent invitation. I want. You like this? Wolf style. Dear God. This was his fault. His blood pounded in his ears. You don't know how much I want to, but I can't. Sure you can. Her tone grew urgent. Please, Jake. I want you so much. Jake. Go with it, Rachel. I'm so mad at you. But her breathing quickened and her muscles clenched in spite of herself. I know. Increasing the pressure and subtly changing the rhythm, he coaxed her toward the brink. She swore softly in protest, but she let him take her there. He pushed her closer, his touch firm and sure, and was rewarded at last with her cry of release, a cry tinged with anger. He hoped she would forgive him. Gradually she sank back to the mattress, but she kept her eyes closed as if she didn't want to look at him. He bitterly regretted that he hadn't been able to give her what she'd asked for. Leaning down, he brushed his lips across hers. I wanted to, Rachel. She took several shaky breaths and kept her eyes closed. I don't believe you. Please believe me. He kissed her again, more fully this time, taking his time to enjoy the velvet texture of her mouth before lifting his head. I couldn't. Too much is at stake. At last she opened her eyes, but her gaze was accusing. It's because I'm human, isn't it? Yes, and I take all the blame for what just happened. I was embarrassed. And angry. My fault. All my fault. He felt like a jerk. I shouldn't have touched you when you were bottoms up like that. A smile threatened to break through. What a way to describe me. Accurate. Though. He began moving slowly within her because he simply had to. He needed that sweet friction. Maybe it would work for her, too. Apparently not tempting enough. Rachel, that position is very special. It's reserved for the moment when werewolves choose a mate. Oh. She went still. Then her voice went up an octave. I almost became your mate. No, he rocked steadily back and forth. She was so wet that he created liquid music with each thrust. I wouldn't have let that happen. But if we'd, both of us would have had to agree it was what we wanted. His climax pressed closer and his breathing grew heavy with anticipation. Didn't want to take a chance of. His focus on the conversation was gone. Of what? She lifted to meet his thrusts with a soft moan. Maybe. Talking became a luxury. In the heat of passion we might, Rachel. You feel so damn good. He shoved in deeper. So good. You're humoring me. No. I swear. He drew back and surged forward again, touching her womb. I'm in heaven. But is it better? He avoided answering her question. It's damn fine. He gulped for air and kept stroking. Better than the wolf position? His groan was a mixture of pleasure and frustration. Don't think about it. He was quickly moving past all thought. Fireworks erupted in his veins as he approached nirvana. I can't stop thinking about it. Let's see what I can do about that. Bracing himself on one arm, he reached down with his free hand to the place where they were joined. As he continued to slide rapidly in and out of her hot body, he teased the spot that should set off a 4-alarm fire. Her reaction was all he could wish for. She began to pant and squirm beneath him. Oh, Jake. Oh, and she erupted, ending the conversation and his attempt at controlling his own climax. With a roar of satisfaction, he shot home once more and came so hard he was afraid he'd damaged himself. So he didn't really care. He was living for the moment, and the moment was filled with splendor and Rachel's cries of ecstasy. Rachel discovered that really good sex made her sleepy. Obviously she'd been deprived of really good sex her entire adult life if she was just finding this out, ignoring the implications of that realization, which included the letdown. When Jake exited the picture, she gave herself up to sleep for the second time. That night, in her dreams, a dark wolf loped through the trees in the perpetual sunset of an Alaskan summer night. As he moved away from her, she called to him, but he didn't slow his pace. When she could no longer see him in the shadows, she turned away, desolated that he was gone. Turn around, Rachel called a voice that sounded like Jake's. I'm here. She did, and the dark wolf was back, his bold and majestic form silhouetted against the golden sky. Come with me. Torn by indecision, she hesitated. The wolf stayed only a moment before wheeling and trotting away. The forest wrapped him in shadows once again, and he was gone. She'd lost her chance. When she opened her eyes, birds chirped outside the window and Jake no longer lay beside her. Her disappointment in not finding him there echoed the sadness of her dream, which had obviously been based on wishful thinking. Jake wouldn't invite her to come with him and share his world. He'd made that clear. Her feeling of loss was slightly eased when she smelled coffee and something even more tantalizing, fresh bread. Waking up in Jake's cabin had its advantages. Although she was in desperate need of a shower, using his without asking seemed wrong. Walking naked into his living room to ask shouldn't have been an issue after the night they'd shared, but full daylight took some of the wind out of her sails. She decided to put on some clothes and go find him after she'd made one little raid on his toothpaste. Climbing out of bed, she crept into a bathroom that was scented with mint aftershave. The thought of a werewolf shaving struck her as funny, especially after the way he'd reacted to her attempt to shave his fur. Fortunately, he'd left a tube of toothpaste, squeezed in the middle but with the cap on, sitting on the counter beside the sink. She squirted a dab on her finger and worked it over her teeth. Cupping her hand under the faucet, she rinsed her mouth and patted it dry on Jake's fluffy bath towel. Much better. She walked back into the bedroom and surveyed the clothes they'd flung off the night before. Her t-shirt wouldn't cover the subject, and getting completely dressed to go ask about a shower made no sense. She spied his green button-up shirt lying in a heap on the floor. That would do nicely. As she slipped her arms into the sleeves, she had a renewed appreciation of how big he was. The cuffs hung inches below the tips of her fingers. She pushed them back so her hands were free to button the shirt, which reached to mid-thigh. No man had ever made her feel so tiny and delicate. Then again, Jake wasn't a man at all. The night before she'd accepted that and reveled in it. She'd reveled a bit too much, in fact. Besides being a teensy bit sore this morning, she'd apparently skated dangerously close to engaging in a werewolf mating ritual. Good thing Jake was dead set against a were-human combo. If he'd shared Duncan McDowell's philosophy, she'd have a whole new set of problems. With Jake, the situation was clear. She didn't want to mate with a werewolf, and he didn't want to mate with a human. Their goals were aligned. Except they both seemed to enjoy burning up the sheets. She couldn't speak for him, but she'd be sorry to end that activity when they inevitably went their separate ways. The sooner they did that, the better, though. She was becoming more attached by the minute. Wearing his soft cotton shirt against her skin felt good. The material had absorbed his scent. Even her human nose could recognize his special aroma, one that she happened to love. But now she understood that her puny senses picked up only a fraction of what was out there. She wondered what life was like for Jake. He must be able to separate and catalog every bird call and record the smell of each creature venturing past his cabin. The prospect felt like sensory overload to her. So many signals coming in. How did he manage to concentrate on anything? Yet the night before he'd certainly been focused exclusively on her. She shivered at the memory of his single-mindedness and how that had turned her into a wild woman. They'd need to tone down their sexual response to each other this morning, or they'd never get their issues sorted out, much as she might daydream about spending several more days alone with Jake and sharing fabulous sex with him. That would be unwise for many reasons. They wouldn't be able to keep the relationship secret that long, plus they both had work to do, and most important, they ran the risk of falling in love. Jake would be easy to love, especially if she didn't think too long about the reality of loving a werewolf. She needed to think about that, though, to keep herself from being stupid. Once she'd buttoned the shirt, she walked out of the bedroom. Jake sat on the sofa with his laptop and a mug of fragrant coffee next to him. On the end table, he glanced up immediately. His smile warmed her down to her bare toes. That shirt never looked half as good on me. She noticed his change of clothes, freshly shaven jaw, and damp hair. Could she have slept through his morning routine? Maybe. Other than her sad dream, she hadn't slept so deeply and peacefully since childhood. This morning she felt energy coursing through her. She itched to go into her shop and tackle a promising piece of wood. The coffee smells great. She returned his smile. Do I also smell bread? Baking? Yep. I hauled out the bread machine this morning. There's nothing like fresh bread for breakfast. You're spoiling me. Happiness bubbled in her, fizzing like champagne. Being here with him felt so right. I'm just grabbing the chance while I have it. As the significance of that statement sank in, a little of her happiness drained away. It's probably good that you said that. Why? Before I came out here I reminded myself that this is temporary, but between the coffee, the bread, and you I started to lose focus. He frowned. Rachel, It's okay. We'll live for the moment but plan for the future, right? Something like that. He switched off his laptop and closed it. Let me get you some coffee and check on the bread. Setting down his laptop, he picked up his mug and stood. Doesn't bread take a long time to bake in those machines? She was no expert, but her mom had one and she remembered a several-hour process. He shrugged. I've been up a while. How long? 2 or 3 hours. Something about the way he answered her question tipped her off that he hadn't been working on his laptop in the pre-dawn hours while she slept. Did you go for a run? Yes. He looked wary. Running helps me think. But don't worry. I didn't shift in the house. No one's around at 3 in the morning, so I could go outside and do it. I know a quiet place back in the trees. You could have shifted in the house. It's your place after all. I didn't want to scare you. I wouldn't have been scared. She realized with some surprise that was true. No matter what form he took, he was still Jake. She'd known him as a man and as a wolf, and he was the same soul, as he'd pointed out the night before. Another image flashed, of dancing light coming out from under her closed kitchen door. Of course that's why he'd gone in there, to try and heal himself. She should have figured that out sooner. You give off light when you shift, don't you? He nodded. She wanted to see him do it. Yes, partly because she was curious and hated to miss something she'd never have a chance to witness again. But that wasn't the main reason. They'd shared so much. The fear and drama of the bear attack, her misguided attempt to care for him afterward, and now their intense sexual connection that fostered an intimacy she'd never known with anyone else. If she never witnessed his shift from man to wolf, or from wolf to man, she'd miss a significant insight into what made him who he was. She'd never forget him, but when she did remember, she wouldn't know the whole story. That seemed important. But she wasn't sure how to ask. If her request came out wrong, she might offend him, as if he were a trained dog being asked to perform tricks. She had far more respect for him than that. Taking a deep breath, she searched for the right words. Jake, I know this might be inappropriate, and if so, you can tell me, but I would love to. Yes. Her eyes widened. Yes? How do you know what I was going to ask? It wasn't rocket science. His green eyes were gentle. You just asked a question about my shift, and then your forehead got all crinkled up and you stared at the floor for quite a while. I could almost hear you thinking. She gazed at him as she remembered something else. That reminds me. After I let you go that evening, I imagined getting mental messages from you as you ran through the woods headed for home. Did I make that up? No, you didn't. I seem to be able to communicate with you at least a little bit when I'm in wolf form. I knew it. The idea thrilled her. It shouldn't be possible. Werewolves can communicate telepathically with each other and with many other animals like the bear, for example. But I've never heard of a werewolf connecting mentally with a human. Wow, that makes me special, huh? Extremely. But then again, you're special without that. He held her gaze. Special enough that I trust you to watch me shift. Thank you. I'm honored. But let's not rush into it. We can have breakfast and head out on that hike. You envision to give us more time to figure out our next move. The hiking idea was brilliant, by the way. She smiled. I have my moments. I can attest to that. He gave her a once-over that made her blush. Thinking of those moments reminded her of her clothes scattered over his bedroom floor. She couldn't spend the day in them. I want to stop by my place so I can change. No problem. I know a trailhead near your cabin that almost no one uses. We'd have the privacy somewhere along that trail for me to show you what happens when I shift. Thank you, Jake. I hope you don't think I'm just a voyeur. He traced her jaw with one finger. You're not just anything, Rachel, least of all a voyeur. If I'd thought that for a second, I wouldn't have offered to let you watch So are you ready to eat? I'd rather shower first if that's okay. Help yourself. But the longer he looked at her, the hotter burned the flame in his green eyes. Maybe you'd better lock the door though. She gulped. Okay. Turning, she walked back into his bedroom and was acutely aware of his gaze following her there. She had the sensation of being tracked, and she liked it way too much. Chapter 15. Jake had wondered if they could pull off their plan without a hitch. Ted had been notified that they were hiking today, but as Jake rode with Rachel over to her place, he suddenly remembered someone else who could be a problem. What about Lionel? I just thought of him too. He'll probably be sitting in the parking area, waiting for me and wondering where the hell I am. What are you going to say? She glanced over at him. I'll let him think that you and I had a wild night together, which we did. He'll be a little embarrassed and let it go. Okay. I'm like his big sister. He'd rather not think about me having a sex life. She approached the parking area at the end of the path leading to her cabin. And sure enough, there he is. Let me do the talking. Absolutely. Lionel sat in his old truck, his earbuds in place, his head moving in rhythm, with the music only he could hear. But he could see perfectly well, and Jake noticed him glance into his rearview mirror when Rachel parked to his left. He'd registered the fact that Jake was in the truck with her. Depending on how observant Lionel was, he also might notice that Rachel was wearing the same clothes she'd had on the day before. Jake figured Lionel didn't miss much. Hey Lionel. Rachel didn't look Jake's way as she grabbed her backpack, climbed down from her truck and walked around to Lionel's. Jake took his time opening the passenger door. If she wanted to advertise that he was her new lover, he'd play along. Romances sprang up and disappeared every day. He and Rachel could be a flash fire that burned itself out in no time. Except he wondered if anyone would believe that of Rachel. Nobody knew him well enough to make a judgment, but Ted and Lionel might doubt that Rachel, woman with deep emotions, could conduct a brief affair without getting hurt. In fact, she couldn't. Neither of them could, and on some level they both knew. But Jake was willing to be the bad guy who left her. He didn't care what others thought of him, but he cared about hurting Rachel, and he now realized that was inevitable. Too late to help it now. Rachel said something to Lionel and they both laughed. She was making light of the situation, which she should when it came to Lionel. Jake vowed to mimic that attitude. Maybe they could fool Lionel into thinking nothing serious was happening. Meanwhile, Jake was beginning to sort out the truth. His connection with Rachel had been intense from the beginning, and now it was off the charts. He knew it was the same with her. He could see it in those silver eyes. Along with that fiery connection, they were developing mutual trust. During his run, he'd realized that was critical now that she knew his secret. Ironically, he had to trust her completely in order to let her go. When their bond became strong enough, they would part. And that was going to hurt like hell. Thoughts like that weren't going to put a bounce in his step, though. He made a conscious effort to smile as he walked toward Rachel and her assistant. I guess we messed up your schedule, huh, Lionel? That's okay, Mr. Hunter. Lionel had a faint blush going on, but he smiled back at Jake. I'd rather have Miss M spend the night with you than that wolf she had living in her cabin. Yeah, I take responsibility for that wolf situation. He hadn't heard the Miss M label. Cute. I've decided he belongs in a wildlife sanctuary after all. He avoided Rachel's gaze and hoped she'd just go with this tall tale. Lionel nodded in approval. Good call. Yeah, after Rachel filled me in on the bear incident, I decided the wolf would get himself killed if I didn't do something to protect him. Didn't matter what story he concocted, so long as nobody expected to see a wolf running around Polecat. They wouldn't see one because he'd be selling his place and moving on. Once he and Rachel said goodbye, he wouldn't be able to stand living across the lake from her. Some lovers you could stay friends with, but Rachel wasn't in that category. Every time he saw her, his heart would bleed. Rachel turned to Lionel. Obviously, I haven't done a lot of work since you were here yesterday, so there isn't much cleanup. Jake wondered how she'd solve this dilemma. Lionel needed the hourly wage. She paid him 5 days a week, and he was an independent contractor, so if he didn't work, he didn't get paid. Tell you what. Rachel crossed her arms and leaned against the dusty fender of Lionel's truck. I'm running low on interesting wood to carve. You want that piece back that you gave me? It's probably too good a piece for me anyway. Lionel's devotion to Rachel was obvious. Jake wondered if his own devotion to her was that obvious. Could be. No, Lionel, Rachel said. That piece has your name on it. But if you'd spend the morning scouring the woods for more like that, I'd be thrilled. You'd help me 1,000 times more than you would by sweeping out my shop. I can do that. Lionel appeared excited about the prospect. I think I know what you're looking for. I'm sure you do. Okay then. I'm off. See you later, Mr. Hunter. I'm glad you found a safe place for that black wolf. Much more time around here and somebody might have shot him. Jake noticed Rachel's shiver. That wouldn't be good, he said. No, Lionel said as he climbed into his truck. The only bad thing is that Miss M used that wolf for inspiration. Now she won't ever get to see him again. I have a really good memory, Rachel said. You still should have taken more pictures while you had the chance. I doubt the wolf would have appreciated that, she said. He was pretty beat up. Her assistant laughed. You think that wolf was vain? I know he was. Rachel sent the briefest of winks in Jake's direction. Sounds like an inside joke. Lionel looked from Rachel to Jake with a bemused expression. Well, see you two later. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. He backed his truck out of the parking area. Rachel glanced up at Jake. I guess that went okay. It went fine. Jake watched Lionel's truck disappear around a curve in the road before turning back to Rachel. He thinks a lot of you. I think a lot of him. He's liable to hunt me down after when all this is over between us. He hated the finality of those words and wondered if she hated it as much as he did. He imagined he saw a flicker of regret in her silver eyes. Then she blinked and her gaze was clear. I'll make sure he knows it was a mutual decision. Lionel is protective, but he listens and he's smart enough to know when to back off. He wanted me to turn you over to game and fish when you were in my cabin, but when I said no, he let me do things my way. I'm grateful. I would never have called them, Jake. As for Lionel, he wouldn't do anything to jeopardize his job with me. I think he knows that I'm hoping he'll become my apprentice. If he starts helping me with the carving, then I can pay him more and give him longer hours. Lucky guy to have the prospect of spending more time with her. That would be a great opportunity for him. And for me, I have more work than I can handle. If I had a partner in the business, it would free me up for other things. Something about the way she said that put him on alert. Like what? She met his gaze and there was a defiant light in her eyes. Like what? Most women my age would like to have a great relationship with a guy, maybe even some kids. Although she might be saying that to find out how he'd react, he pretended that the concept of her with someone else didn't bother him at all. Sounds reasonable. But inside he was screaming in protest, which he had no right to do. Being with you has convinced me I have to try harder to find that. I've been so wrapped up in my work that I haven't made dating a priority. When nobody interesting turned up on the internet sites, I let the whole idea drop. So how are you going to meet Mr. Wonderful? From a possessive standpoint, Jake didn't want her anywhere near another male. From a security standpoint, he wondered if a close relationship would make her more vulnerable to accidentally revealing the secret she had to keep. Good question. Hoisting her backpack over her shoulder, she started down the path toward her cabin. I'll probably get my friends in Fairbanks involved. We've known each other since college, and they've been after me to get a life. Jake fell into step beside her. Do you see them much? Not as much as I should, but I've been so busy with work. That's my whole point. I need to reduce the number of hours so I can socialize more. Right. But he couldn't help worrying. He pictured nights of food, wine, and laughter. Her guard would be down. A slip of the tongue would be so easy. Your jaw is clenched, big boy. What's up? He consciously relaxed his muscles. Sorry. Just thinking. You're afraid I'll spill the beans to my friends, aren't you? He glanced at her. You wouldn't mean to. I wouldn't do it, period. But let's say for the sake of argument that I got a little tipsy and started talking about you. Then I had another glass of wine. And told everyone that I slept with a werewolf. He stopped walking as his whole body tightened. But you wouldn't. She stopped too and turned back to him. Of course not, but even if I did. Don't you see what would happen? No one would believe me. They'd laugh and think I was making a joke. There's no way I could accidentally betray you. Wouldn't be taken seriously. I suppose you have a point. He scrubbed a hand over his face and sighed. You'll have to forgive me for my paranoia. I've never been in this situation before. Neither of us has, she said gently. What about this great guy you're hoping to find? Wouldn't you be tempted to tell him eventually? It's a big secret to keep for a lifetime. And if he loves you, he's not going to think you're crazy. Jake knew that much for sure. Any male in love with Rachel would know she wouldn't lie to him. She moved close enough to lay her palms against his chest. I will keep this secret for a lifetime. Her eyes glowed with purpose and something he dared not name. Whatever relationship I have with this person, Jake, I won't be sharing my memories of you. Even if I hadn't promised you to keep my mouth shut, I still wouldn't share with anyone. Our time together is private. She lifted her face and brushed her lips over his. Special. With a groan he pulled her into his arms and captured her mouth in a kiss that said all that he could not say. He poured all his longing and frustration into that kiss. She responded by wrapping her arms around his neck and pressing herself tight against him, as if she wanted to climb right inside and never leave. Unable to help himself, he hoisted her up, backpack and all, so she could wrap both legs around him too. She cooperated with the plan and then moved out of kissing range by leaning her head back. Hey, don't stop kissing me. I just want to know where you're going with this maneuver. From the sound of this tune, I suggest we play it inside. Excellent suggestion. He carried her to the front door and held her tight, not wanting to break the erotic connection, while she unhooked her backpack and located her keys. She finally found them after much wiggling around. Her cheeks were flushed and her breathing uneven by the time she pulled the key out and fitted in the lock. I think that counts as foreplay. Good thing, because I'm not in the mood to dawdle once we get in there. She tightened her thighs. How gratifying to have an eager man. An eager lover. He carried her over the threshold. He liked the sound of lover, even if it did imply more than a 2-day affair. Once they were inside, she dropped the backpack to the floor. To the right. I remember exactly where it is. He kicked the door shut and headed for her bedroom. And how desperately I wanted to be in human form that night so I could do to you then exactly what I'm about to do to you this morning. What if you'd shifted in the kitchen like you planned? Would you have come back to ravish me? No, couldn't risk it. He reached the bed and lowered her to the thick mattress. But I intend to ravish you now. Oh, I do hope so. Count on it. And he reached for her shoe. His undressing technique wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Her jeans and shoes made it off undamaged, but her panties did not. He didn't worry about taking off either his shirt or hers. All he needed was access to her wet, juicy. You never did tell me, Jake. Tell you what. Bracing himself on his forearms, he gazed into her silver eyes. How he loved watching them darken with pleasure as he began to stroke. Whether you like werewolf sex better than human sex. No comparison. Which was true. Nothing compared with this. He changed the angle slightly and caught his breath at how good that felt. Because where sex is better? Her breathing grew shallow as she lifted to meet his thrusts. No, he picked up the pace. Then human sex is better? She moaned and arched against him. Rachel. As she tightened around him, nearly at the edge and his climax hovered poised to follow hers, lust clouded his brain. Tell me, Jake. She panted with excitement. Her body hot and trembling. Invited him to plunge deeper. Rachel. He drove into her and she came in a burst of glory, her cries urging him on. He moved faster and then even faster. When he erupted, his release curled his toes. Rachel's sex. Sometime later, he rested his cheek against her shoulder, still covered with the cotton of her t-shirt. She slid her hand up under his shirt to caress his back. Her touch was so sweet. He lay there with his eyes closed and soaked up the joy of being with her. She turned her head and kissed his hair. I heard you say something right at the end about the time you were coming. Probably glory hallelujah. No, it sounded more like Rachel's sex. Don't know. Might have said that. I think you did. She kissed his hair again. Yes, I think that's what you said. He decided not to confirm or deny, but apparently in the frenzy of making love to her, he'd managed to confess his true feelings. He no longer cared about the difference between human and were sex. The only female he wanted were or human was Rachel. That had been true even before they'd consummated this love affair, but now it was indelibly burned into his psyche. That could be a problem someday in the future when he had to choose a mate, but he couldn't change what had happened. Jake's sex is the best too, she said softly. Just so you know. I shouldn't be so damned happy to hear that. His earlier thoughts about causing her pain drifted back to him. He tried to push them away, but they were persistent devils. I should want this experience to be just okay so you can leave me and quickly find someone who's 10 times better at pleasing you. You should, but you don't. It was a statement, not a question. She continued to stroke his back. That's right. What I'd really like is for you to have no more lovers after me, but that's completely unrealistic, so I'll settle for them being less competent than I am. I think it's good that you're admitting this, she said. We should always tell each other the truth. The truth isn't very pretty. Now you know that I'm a selfish bastard who doesn't want another male getting top billing, even if that means you end up with less pleasure in your life as a result. I'm not proud of that. She ran her fingers down his backbone. Why do you suppose I kept pestering you about werewolf versus human sex? I know once you leave me you'll mate with a werewolf. I don't want you to have more fun with her than you've had with me. So I'm selfish too. He chuckled. What a fine mess we made for ourselves, huh? I suppose so, but I'm not sorry. I'm not either. You're sure? Her question had a slightly uneasy lilt to it. Yep. She let out her breath in a whoosh. That's a relief, Jake. I was afraid you might be sorry, considering how getting tangled up with me goes against your beliefs. I don't regret a single second I've shared with you. Well, maybe the agony of having you clean my wounds, but even that had its moments. See, that would never happen now. If you hurt yourself, I'd let you handle it. She fell silent as she continued her lazy caress. So how many humans are mated with werewolves? Only a handful so far. Why? Just curious. Her hand grew still. How has that changed their lives? Exactly. Jake recognized a leading question when he heard one. He lifted his head to look into her eyes. It's changed their lives drastically, Rachel. In what way? I mean, werewolves live as humans a good part of the time, so aside from having your mate shift and go for a run in the woods now and then, what's so different about living with a werewolf? Everything. He eased away from her and climbed out of bed. Let's take that hike we planned. It's time you watched me shift. Good. I want to do that. She scooted off the bed. I think it'll be cool. It may not be quite what you think. I've seen Lady Hawk. You're not going to shock me if that's what you're afraid of. I haven't seen that movie, but Hollywood's version of shapeshifting usually isn't anything like the real event. I'm just warning you that it might be a little unnerving. I doubt it. Okay. But he sincerely hoped it would unnerve her. Her line of questioning certainly was unnerving him. He didn't have to be a genius to figure out where those questions were coming from. After fun and games with a human version of Jake Hunter, she'd begun to convince herself that maybe he wasn't that different from any human she might hang out with. Perhaps hooking up with him wouldn't have to change her life very much after all. She was building castles in the air. Time to bring her down to earth. Chapter 16. After freshening up and putting on clean clothes, Rachel was in a jubilant mood as she and Jake left her cabin. Jake had appropriated her backpack to carry a couple of stainless steel water bottles, a bag of trail mix she happened to have on hand, and his cell phone. He'd turned the phone off with a comment about hating the sound of a phone in the wilderness, but he admitted they were helpful in an emergency. Anyone watching the two of them setting off down the trail would assume they were simply day hikers out to enjoy an Alaskan summer day. Not quite, but by the time they returned to her cabin, she would have seen something few humans had. She suspected that Jake wanted to scare her a little with this shifting business. Maybe it was a test, and if so, she intended to pass it with flying colors. The more time she spent with Jake, the less ridiculous she found the idea of mating with a werewolf. She was an artist who lived an unconventional life. She spent long hours in an isolated workshop, so logically she'd be a better candidate for an alternate lifestyle than a corporate type. Lionel's presence in her life could present a challenge, but she might be able to get around that. Other humans had done it. She'd read enough of Duncan McDowell's book to believe that human pairings weren't the unmitigated disaster that Jake insisted they were. She'd love to be able to talk with one of those humans, but she couldn't do that. She wasn't supposed to know what she knew, so that kept her trapped in silence. Jake was her only source of information, and his view was biased. And yet, as they set out on the narrow trail he'd chosen, Jake in the lead, she wondered if his views were as rigid as they had been a few days ago. They'd had some really hot sex, and some cozy shared moments of friendship. He seemed as crazy about her as she was about him. If she was willing to consider the possibility of this mating business, then perhaps Jake could be swayed. First, though, she had to show him that his shifting demonstration wouldn't freak her out. She was slightly apprehensive, anyone would be, but this was Jake. She'd keep that in mind during the transformation and all would be well. They arrived at a fork in the trail, and Jake turned back to her. I was planning to take the left fork, but I just remembered that you sent Lionel out searching for wood. I did. Sorry about that. I was only thinking about giving him a job so he could both earn his regular wage and get out of our hair. Yeah, I know. But I'd hate like hell to run into him. Jake adjusted his sunglasses, which made him look seriously hot, and glanced through the trees. Do you have any idea which way he might have gone? No, then she had an inspiration. But surely he'll want to stay close to his truck so he won't have far to carry the pieces. Jake's smile flashed. An obvious point I completely missed. He's 19. He'll want to conserve energy. If we hike a good distance down the trail, either trail will be far beyond where he'd go. I'm sure we will. She was dazzled by how gorgeous he was. The dappled shade lovingly caressed his broad shoulders, and his worn jeans seemed custom-made for his lean hips and tight buns. Now that she'd sampled the rugged beauty of a werewolf in human form, she couldn't imagine being satisfied with anything less. Jake would simply have to see things her way. Then we're off. Let me know if I'm going too fast for you. I'm fine. She blessed the long legs she'd inherited from her mother's side of the family. Although she couldn't match Jake for sheer athleticism, she could keep up if he didn't go any faster than this. If she hoped to snag herself a werewolf, she'd have to demonstrate some stamina. Once again she wondered if the other humans tried to keep up with their more physically gifted mates or if they'd reached an understanding about human limits. If there wasn't a support group for human mates of werewolves, there should be. She chuckled to herself. If Jake could read her mind right now, he'd have a stroke. But if he imagined that he had total control of what would happen between them, he had a lot to learn about her. What's so funny back there? She just suggested that they should always tell each other the truth. Time to put up or shut up on that score. I was wondering if there was a support group for human mates of werewolves. He came to such an abrupt halt that she almost ran into him. His shoulders rose and fell with his deep inhale and exhale before he turned to face her. With his sunglasses and forbidding expression, he looked like a cop about to hand out a ticket. That's not the solution we're going to choose for this problem. If you're thinking in that direction, then you need to think again. She laid a finger against his perfectly sculpted lips. But isn't the point of brainstorming solutions to consider all the possibilities? He wrapped her hand in both of his and eased it away from his mouth. That isn't a possibility. Why not? She couldn't see his green eyes behind the sunglasses and she thought he might have worn them on purpose as a shield. In the shade of the fragrant evergreens, he didn't really need them, which was why she'd left hers at home. Don't you want me? His jaw tightened. That's not fair. You know I do. Then take me. Make me your mate. It's not like we'd be the first to do that. I don't care if 100 wers have taken human mates. Still a huge mistake, and I won't contribute to the chaos that will result. What chaos? Duncan says the pairs that are already mated are living in harmony with their families. Someone named Emma is mated with a werewolf named Aidan, and yes, and they've already had a baby born of that mating, but no one can predict if the kid will be wer or human. Her parents won't know, and she won't know until she reaches puberty. Can you imagine the stress of that on a family, on a young female? I suppose it would be unsettling not to know until it happens, or it doesn't. She wondered which the child would wish for. Would she want to turn out like mom or dad? That's my point. Emma and Aidan have chosen that stress for themselves, which is one thing, but they've chosen it for a baby who has to live with that choice, like it or not. I won't do that. Rachel wasn't ready to give up that easily. Why did they make that decision? To deal with the stress, do you suppose? They claim to be soul mates who belong with each other. Jake's voice faltered for the first time. I can't. I don't really believe that's true. Why couldn't it be true? And if it is, their child has the benefit of two parents who are devoted to each other. That's huge, probably more important to the kid's well-being than the we're human dilemma. That's a judgment call. One I'm prepared to make. Damn it, Jake, I wish you'd take off your sunglasses so I can see your eyes. This is an important conversation we're having and you're hiding. All right. He pulled off his glasses and gazed at her with troubled green eyes. I'm upset, okay? Happy now. Jake. She put a soothing hand on his arm. He stepped back. Sorry, but I can't think straight when you're touching me. Doesn't that tell you anything? Who knows? Do you think I haven't wondered if this is some cosmic joke that the first female I have a real connection to happens to be human? He was beginning to tick her off with his one-note rant. How about a cosmic gift? How about that positive interpretation instead? How about we rejoice in the miracle of finding each other and figure out how we can be together? And you're so sure you're ready for that? I think I am, yes. Let's find out, shall we? He shrugged out of the backpack and dropped it to the ground. Then he started stripping off his clothes with angry, jerky movements. Let's find out how you react to watching a man change into a wolf. Right in front of your eyes. Rachel glanced around, her heart pounding. Jake, we haven't gone very far down the path. Maybe we should hike a ways more before you do this. Nervous, Rachel? Not for myself. For you. I think we should be in a more remote area. Truthfully, though, he was scaring her with his abrupt decision to shift with no time for her to mentally prepare for it. She'd imagined he'd seek out a secluded glen and the process would be slow and ethereal. She'd envisioned his shifting as a magical experience. Logically there wouldn't be music, but she thought there should be. Like in Lady Hawk. But this wasn't Hollywood, as he'd warned her earlier. Definitely not Hollywood. Jake tossed his clothes to the side of the trail and stretched out naked in the middle of the dirt. She winced. At the very least, he should have had grass or pine boughs. Something other than dirt. But if that was his choice, she would get down to his level and watch this up close and personal. She sat down on the trail beside him. This position had an added benefit. If the shock caused her to faint, she wouldn't have so far to fall. She hadn't picked a very good spot. A sharp rock was digging into her fanny. She was about to move when Jake took a deep breath and began to glow. Mesmerized, she went completely still. The effect was muted by daylight and would have been more pronounced at night. But Jake was definitely giving off a pulsing light. And his body, the one she'd enjoyed so thoroughly in the past few hours, the one she'd stroked and kissed, had begun to change. Heart pounding and stomach clenched, she made herself watch without looking away. But several times she wanted to avert her eyes from this strangely beautiful yet completely unnatural process. No, this wasn't Lady Hawk. That Hollywood transformation had taken place with shifting light and evocative music, of course, but this was more like a carnival show's house of mirrors trick as Jake's body stretched and realigned to accommodate the very different form of a wolf. He grew increasingly hairy and his face gradually evolved into that of a beast. When he was no longer recognizably human, Rachel sucked in a breath. She was shocked by the change and embarrassed by her visceral reaction, which contained equal doses of amazement and dread. She hoped Jake hadn't heard her gasp, but he probably had. He'd already told her of a wolf's acute sensory perception. The shift seemed to take forever, although in reality it might have been only a couple of minutes. They were highly charged minutes, though, and Rachel held her breath through most of it. No wonder Jake had insisted that she had to watch this. Until now, she'd been living in a fantasy world in which Jake had presented himself as either a wolf or a human. The metamorphosis from one to the other hadn't factored into her view of him. But any human who planned to enter the world had better accept this process. She wasn't even close to acceptance. At long last, a large black wolf lay on the path where Jake had been before. Rachel drew breath into her burning lungs and stared at the animal as she tried to convince herself that it was still Jake. She had a tough time making the mental adjustment. The wolf's flanks heaved, and then he rose slowly to his feet. After an initial period of unsteadiness, his massive chest inflated and he lifted his broad head and turned it in Rachel's direction. Jake's green eyes, their shape altered but their color identical, stared at her. They were almost nose to nose. Then, clear as a bell, a mental transmission arrived. Well, she answered without thinking. You were right. I wasn't prepared for that. Then she realized that he'd communicated through telepathy. Could she do the same? But I didn't faint. Give me credit for that at least. At least you wouldn't have had far to fall. Part of my plan. She gazed into his wolf's eyes. Jake, we're talking. Without speaking. He blinked at her. So it seems. Can other humans do that with a werewolf? Never heard of it happening before. Her smile was triumphant. See, how can you deny that we're destined to be together? You make it sound like such a simple. Jake's ears flicked and his gaze left hers. His body tensed and he growled. For one wild moment she wondered if the growl was meant for her. No, something else. Rachel. Lionel's panicked cry came from somewhere behind her. Dear God. Lionel, stay back. Lightheaded with fear for Jake, she scrambled to her feet and spun in Lionel's direction. It's okay. Stay back. Don't move. Lionel's shouted command was followed by the crack of a rifle and a sharp yelp of pain. Jake. Gulping in terror, she swung back to the spot where he'd been. Empty. When she scanned the trees, she saw nothing. Her shoulders sagged. He got away, but he was wounded, and it was her fault. She spied his pile of clothes and kicked them under an overhanging bush as Lionel came crashing through the forest towards her. Damn it. Just nicked him. Rifle in hand, Lionel arrived panting. Did he bite you? Are you bleeding? No, but Jake might be. She fought to stay focused. Jake needed her to be calm, to take charge, to protect him if she could. He wasn't attacking me. Not yet, maybe, but he had you down and next he would have gone for your throat. Thank God I showed up. Where the hell is Mr. Hunter? He, had something he had to do, so I decided to take a hike. She grabbed up the backpack before Lionel thought to do it. He might catch a glimpse of Jake's clothes hidden under the bush if he inspected the ground too carefully. So he left you to amuse yourself and then you get attacked by his wolf, which was supposed to be on its way to a sanctuary. Mr. Hunter is not taking very good care of you, Miss M. She thought quickly about how to explain the sudden appearance of the black wolf. Lionel wouldn't believe he'd seen a different one just now. Jake was too distinctive. Maybe the wolf escaped while he was being transported to the sanctuary. Well, that's not good. Lionel peered at her. Are you sure you're okay? You're really white. I'm fine. She wished she could try to connect telepathically with Jake, but Lionel might notice her acting strangely and ask more questions. Let me take that backpack. You look like you're about ready to fall down. She let him have it. No harm in that. I'm not used to guns going off. She took a shaky breath. Listen, that wolf's probably miles away by now. Let's go. Back to my cabin. Okay. Lionel nodded, although he seemed reluctant to leave. He kept glancing towards the trees. I'll drive you. My truck's not too far from here. Good. He started off, the backpack slung over his shoulder. Her heart still back in the woods with Jake, she forced herself to leave. She had to get Lionel out of here. She lengthened her strides to keep up with him. As they walked back down the trail, he glanced over his shoulder and slowed down. Am I going too fast for you? No. I want to get back. Mostly she wanted Lionel to get back, and then she had to find a way to ditch him. She hoped Jake would circle around to her cabin, even if he could heal his wounds by himself. They had unfinished business. We'll be there before you know it, Miss M. After I take you home, lock yourself inside and stay there until I've bagged that wolf. She sucked in a breath and her vision blurred for a second. She had to clear her throat before she could speak. Let him go, Lionel. I promise you he's not a threat to anyone. After what I just saw, you can't promise that. He's wild and he's dangerous. No telling what he did to escape from his cage and come back here. There could be people lying in the road with their throats ripped out, for all we know. Lionel, that's ridiculous. If only she could tell him how ridiculous that scenario was, but she couldn't. I wish I'd nailed him when I had the chance, but when I saw you down on the ground, and him looming over you like he was about to have you for breakfast, I was shaking so bad my aim was off. Some hero I am. She offered up a silent prayer of thanks that Lionel had been shaken enough to affect his aim. He hadn't managed to kill Jake. Now she had to make sure he didn't get a second chance. Lionel, I'm begging you not to go after him. Sorry, Miss M. I stood by while you kept that wolf in your house, but at least then he was wounded and not his usual self. You may not want to believe that he means to hurt you, but I know what I saw. I was talking to him, Lionel. While you were on the ground? Yes. Because he knocked you over, right? No, he didn't. I wanted to get down on his level. He's more like a dog than a wolf. Jake would hate to hear her say such a thing. Trust me, he's harmless. You always want to think the best of everyone, Miss M, including that wolf. But when I came through the trees, he was completely focused on you. His eyes were like laser beams trained right on you, which means only one thing. He was ready to take you out. Rachel racked her brain trying to think of a way to buy Jake some time. How are you planning to hunt him? The idea of Jake being hunted sent chills down her spine. Track him. They reached the truck and Lionel opened the passenger door for her. If I'm lucky, I nicked him bad enough that he's bleeding and I can follow a trail of blood. She was determined not to panic. Instead of getting into the cab, she turned to Lionel. If you're dead set on doing this, I'm going with you. Let's go. Find that wolf. She could slow him down at the very least and interfere with his aim if he got close enough to shoot. I'm not taking you, Miss M. You don't have the stomach for killing a wolf. Get that, this wolf being your inspiration and all, but Lionel, if you shoot him, I'll never be able to carve again. She looked him straight in the eye when she said it. Maybe the dramatic statement would work. He was young and impressionable. Besides, she'd spoken the God's truth. She couldn't imagine living and working in a world that didn't have Jake in it. Ah, Miss M. Don't say something like that. It's only a wolf. She thought maybe she'd struck a nerve. No, he's my wolf, Lionel. Don't kill my wolf. Lionel blew out a breath and looked down at the ground. I don't like the idea of him running around loose. He glanced up, his broad, honest face filled with concern. I'm worried about you. I know you are. Look, I'll go home and stay in my house. I won't do anything foolish, or anything more foolish than she'd already done, which gave her plenty of leeway. I'm sure the wolf only wants to get away and be left in peace. Give him a chance to do that, okay? It's against my better judgment, but if that's how you want it, okay. If he shows up at your place, you have to call me. I will. But she wouldn't promise to make that call immediately.